Hebrews, James, and then 1 Peter, strangers and pilgrims. I want you to listen again. 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 9 through 11. Remember, I want you to get this morning. You are to be separate. You are to be different. You are to be strange, okay? Aliens. 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 9 through 11. But you are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people belonging to God, that you may declare the praises of him who called you out of the darkness into his wonderful light. Verse 10, once you were not a people, but now you are the people of God. Once you had not received mercy, but now you have received mercy. Dear friends, Peter writes, I urge you as aliens and strangers in the world to abstain from evil desires which war against your soul. I don't know how much clearer I can say that. We're to be different. We're not to be like the world. We're to be separate from the world. You and I ought to have a testimony that says, I'm something different than I used to be. I'm something different than the world around me. I'm really more concerned about spiritual things. And I have to confess to you this morning, I wish I could say matter-of-factly that I think a lot more about spiritual things than temporary things. But I can't. I just can't. There's so many things that pull against us. There are so many things that drag us down. There are so many things that occupy our time. And we spend so much time doing those things. And I'll tell you this, many of those things are absolutely necessary and important, and they go into making our lives what they are. But there's a whole lot of those things that you and I would be better off without. And I have, in the last year or so, decided there's a lot of things I don't need anymore. And I'm working to get rid of those things. And they're just things that filled the time for me. They're just things that kind of occupied my brain. They're things that I read, the things that I were interested in, but they weren't really things that helped me to become more spiritual. They didn't hurt me in any way, but they just didn't help me to become more spiritual. Some of them hurt me, like watching news. That hurt me a lot. I mean, I just figured, why drag myself down watching news? You know, there's enough things to do that anyway. So I said, I don't really need that. I need enough to help me be in the know and to help me not be a total rube, somebody who doesn't know what's going on. But I didn't need all that I was getting. So I've decided in my life I'm going to do better to think more about the spiritual things and to build a foundation in my life on spiritual things and on God. Now let's look again at the book of Zechariah. This book, it breaks nicely into two divisions. The first 8 chapters are prophecy during the building of the temple. And the last 6 are prophecy after the building of the temple. You know, you can read a lot of different books in the Bible and they're just going all over the place. But Zechariah, I mean, maybe the guy was an accountant or something, but he really could put things together and make them fit, and I appreciate that. But that's just a little bit of history on Zechariah and the book that he wrote. But the most important thing about the book of Zechariah is this, and it's in the Old Testament, so you wouldn't expect this. But the main theme in the book of Zechariah, and it's found on almost every page, every chapter, is the Christ, the Christ, the Christ. He talks over and over again. He appears again and again in the book of Zechariah. Zechariah prophesied more about the coming of Jesus Christ than any other prophet in the Old Testament, with the exception of Isaiah. Now, I realize this is a little bit more of a Bible study than a sermon, but trust me, I'll probably get out of the Bible study part and into the sermon soon enough. But he prophesied more about Christ than anyone else in the Old Testament except for Isaiah. And I want you to see Zechariah, and I want you to see how he saw Christ in these 14 chapters and throughout this book of Zechariah. So this brings us to the very first point of the outline. And I'll tell you right now, and the reason partly I gave you that little card, so you can read about Zechariah, read those 14 chapters. It'll only take you a little while, and study it a little more because we'll probably be there for at least one more week. But the first point in the outline is simply this. Zechariah saw Christ the servant man. Zechariah saw Christ the servant man. Chapter 3. Listen, O high priest Joshua, and your associates seated before you, who are men symbolic of things to come. I am going to bring my servant. In your Bible or whatever you're reading is New Testament. Mark chapter 10 verse 45 says, for the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for want to hear. And so many of the world want to do that because they want you to go. And I kind of drew this out of my memory. It is a giant pyramid that is like a memorial to what America is like today. What America is like today. And it's got 4 levels. Myself. Second from the bottom is mine. Second from the top is me. And the very top is I. And the title in that political cartoon was Speaking of the American Cult. Americans, way back when this was written, quite some years ago, were more concerned about themselves than anything else. And they still are. So much so that if you can't hardly read them up there, but there's 4 popular slogans that were around at that time. Have it your way. Do yourself a favor. You owe it to yourself. You deserve a break today. And surrounding the borders of this and at the base of this, there were tens of thousands of people raising hands, worshiping this monument. You think about that, and that's the way so many, not just in America, but in the world, live. Life is really about me. Don't you understand? Life is about me. Life is about getting what I want. Life is about doing the things that make me happy. Life is about doing something good for myself. And the world is preoccupied with serving self and very seldom thinking much about serving others. And yet here he is, Jesus, saying, I am come to be a servant. I have come to be a servant. He does not come as a mighty king. In Zechariah chapter 9, verse 9, it says, he comes as one lowly. Listen, rejoice greatly, O daughter of Zion. Shout, daughter of Jerusalem. See, your king comes to you, righteous and having salvation, gentle and riding on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey. A lowly servant riding on a donkey. Jesus is a servant of mankind. He is a giver, not a taker. He is the servant man. He is the epitome. He is the absolute everything of what a servant and what a Christian ought to be. There was never anything in his life about him. Never. Too many today are unwilling to become servants. And I'm speaking in the world that we live in, but also sometimes within the church, there are people who are unwilling to become servants. There's a poem that was written, I'd like to share it with you. It's about someone that was in a church. He says, I'll go where you want me to go, dear Lord. Real service is what I desire. I'll sing you a solo anytime, dear Lord, but please don't ask me to be in the choir. I'll do what you want me to do, dear Lord. I like to see things come to pass, but don't ask me to teach boys and girls, oh Lord. I'd rather stay in my class. I've heard that one many times through my life. I'll do what you want me to do, dear Lord. I yearn for the kingdom to thrive. I'll give you my nickels and dimes, dear Lord, but please don't ask me to tithe. I'll go where you want me to go, dear Lord. I'll say what you want me to say. But I'm busy now with myself, dear Lord. I'll help you some other day. That's the world that we live in today. And it's not just within the church. It is in everything. It is in everything. So many organizations over the last 20, 30 years have been done away with because they can't find enough people. Whether it's the VFW, whether it's the Boy Scouts, the Girl Scouts, whether it's the community chest, different types of things where people used to volunteer and make things happen. It's not happening anymore because the world today says it's about I, me, mine, myself. It's about doing what I want. It's about getting something for me. It's about bow down and worship me because I'm the one that's important, not all these other things. There's a crying need for people to volunteer, a crying need for servants in the world today. There is a crying need for servants in the church. And Jesus gave the example, I came to be a servant. And you and I, if we will follow him, we will understand it's not about some grand program or some romantic adventure that we're going on. It's just to become servants in the world for Jesus Christ. I was a servant this last week, and I didn't even really mean to be. I was coming out of a restaurant after I had eaten, and I saw a man coming. He was moving kind of slow, so I'm like, well, I'll hold the door for him. It was raining pretty hard, and I didn't realize that the door opened right above the eave of the restaurant. So I'm holding the door for him, and it's pouring down, and he was walking really slow, and I'm like, it's okay. And he goes, thank you so much. And then I look to the left, and here comes a woman, and then another woman, and then two girls, and I'm just like, okay, come on, I'll hold it. So I got to be a servant, a wet servant at that. And I realize we laugh about that, and that's a little thing, but how many people do you know that just would slam the door in your face? How many people do you know that don't have any interest in doing anything for anybody? You and I need to follow the humble one who was the servant, who didn't stop and worry about what he was doing when he bowed down to worship the dirty, filthy feet of his disciples. He says, I've given you an example, and you and I are to follow it. Now, the Jews, they could not understand this. They could not grasp it. Again, I'll tell you, we've been watching The Chosen, and they just can't get the idea that Jesus is doing all this for nothing except for the furtherance of the kingdom of God and to see people saved. They could not get that. So in chapter 14, verse 9, Zechariah says they wanted the Christ of the crown. Zechariah chapter 14, verse 9, the Lord will be king over the whole earth. On that day, not what they got. Instead, they got this, the one that nobody wanted. In chapter 12, verse 10, chapter 12, verse 10, and I will pour out on the house of David and its inhabitants of Jerusalem a spirit of grace and supplication. They will look on me, the one they have pierced, and they will mourn for him as one mourns for one who has lost an only child, and grieve bitterly for him as one grieves for a firstborn son. They did not want the Christ of the cross. They did not want that humble servant. They wanted someone, and it's repeated time and time again, that was going to deliver them from Rome and from the bondage that they were in. They wanted someone who was going to get them out of this world and get them into a better world, meaning a world that's not controlled by the Romans,